I don't have you on here. Oh no.
Oh no,
Hello and welcome. Wait, where are you, Dom? I don't have you on here.
I'm
Oh
in the
no.
ether.
Oh no. Hello and
Hidden.
welcome. Wait, I don't know what's happening. I'm looking for my friend Dom, and I don't see him.
There's no way you can tell that we prepared for this 3 minutes ago.
Oh no.
So,
Oh wait, there you are.
oh, there we
I
go.
minimized you, and that
Wow,
that did bad
rude.
things. Hi, everybody, and welcome. I'm Jim, and this is Dom.
Hello.
Dom, tell us who you are. I do this every time.
Yeah, let's do it. I'm an engineer on the Hubs team.
Yay. Welcome. And I'm Jim. I'm an artist on the Hubs team. And today we decided that instead of having a whole bunch of prepared things we were going to do, so this could be a disaster, we are going to talk just about some random stuff. Like stuff came up this week. We had a lot of users asking questions this week, as usual. And some of the questions were pretty good, like good enough that I was like, we should really talk about that because while a lot of the hubs and spoke features are pretty well documented, a lot of them, believe it or not, are not well documented. And so while we're, that's an ongoing process. But in the meantime, there were some topics that we see come up time and time again. And a big one to start with is people talking about their floor plan in their scenes when they're trying to make a scene in hubs. I'm sure you've dealt with this before, Dom. You make a scene.
Yeah.
Maybe you even built it out of like really, really simple parts, and then we kind of like auto-generate where you can walk. And that kind of seems like magic sometimes, and it kind of is, but not really. Once you understand how it works, it's really not so bad. But the hard part is understanding how it works. Now, Dom, can you give us a little background on how what we use? Like, how do we do that? How do we generate where you walk?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, definitely the moving around in hubs is one of the more confusing parts when people are trying to create scenes. Like, they don't really understand. They're like, oh, well, I made this collidable. It doesn't work. Like, what's the difference between collidable and walkable? Um, so, basically, the way you move around in hubs, you're not actually using the physics system to run into objects and collide with them. That stuff is all only used for colliding with objects. So if you spawn a duck or something like that, the fact that it's hitting the walls, that's all using physics. But when you're moving around, there's actually something called the navigation mesh, and so it's just only the walkable area of the scene is covered by nav mesh, and so you can show by like if you teleport around or like bring up the teleporter and you kind of wave your cursor around, you can see that when it's hovering over certain things, it's going to be like you can teleport there, and then certain parts it's going to turn red and you can't. And that's all based on the navigation mesh. It's not doing anything with like the physics collisions or anything like that. And so the in Spoke we have kind of a tool to help you generate this navigation mesh by looking at all of your geometry and the collidable things you have, and walkable things you've configured in Spoke. And we can go over like the details, but like what it ends up doing is it breaks up the scene into a bunch of little, cubes, voxels, and then looks at what's inside of them, and then kind of creates a simplified mesh based on that, on like what surfaces are horizontal, and it handles stairs. There's all sorts of settings you can configure, and we'll go over those in Spoke. But ultimately, what that's spitting out is this navigation mesh, and then we use that to create like a graph to like typically navigation meshes are used in games for like pathfinding. If you have like some AI or something and you want them to be able to figure out where to walk around, often navigation meshes are used for that. The way we're using it is a little bit weird. It's not like completely unheard of. This is not like a novel technique we're doing, but like it's not as common to use it for moving the character around. But what's really nice about it is it allows us to do like the teleporting stuff. All kind of just works with that. And we can smoothly move up and down surfaces, and it's also cheaper to do than a physics-based approach. But we are looking into maybe in the future doing a more physics-based thing so that you can do things like jumping, which people ask for all the time.
Why does everybody want to jump? I don't get it. I guess it's
fun.
just something to do.
I get it. Yeah.
Well, in this case, I mean, here's actually a pretty good example. Now, this whole scene was built out of pieces of the architecture kit that ships, like I say ships. We don't ship a product. It's in the browser, but it comes with Spoke when you run it, and you can see how to run Spoke above there. But what I've got here is, an auto-generated floor plan which is why I can't walk through these steps or through
Hmm.
this wall. The wall itself is not stopping me. It's the fact that I'm hitting the edge of the floor plan. And you can tell that because when you go up and down stairs like these, it's a smooth ramp. I'm not like bumping up each step.
Yeah, and we can show the
Whereas
floor plan in
physics
Spoke to.
objects fall down the actual bumpy steps. So that
Yep.
is kind of the ideal scenario in a way, at
Hmm.
least in what we're dealing with. So you're not like, when you're going up and down. I
Yeah, I
just
mean, even in games where you would do physics-based navigation, you still probably would have a simplified mesh for the character and stuff like that to move around on, just for exactly like you said, so that you're not bumping up and down stairs and things like that.
Right. I'm going to show a couple images here that Dom sent me like 2 minutes ago. That kind of helps illustrate a little bit about what happens in this process. What you see in this first picture is,
This is just an example scene
yeah, you can
that
imagine it's built out of some really simple primitives, some blocks and
Mhm.
maybe a couple cylinders and maybe some interesting terrain, but not a whole lot there. And then when this goes through the process of
This is
being
in
turned into,
Spoke, like turning
yep,
it into a navigation mesh.
into floor plan, what it does is it under the hood, you don't really see this happen, but it breaks up the scene um, into voxels like this. Now, the resolution of those voxels, in other words, how small those little cubes are, is something you have some control over. There's some
Hmm.
settings you can change. We set what we think is a pretty good default for the size environments that most people are working with. Since we're dealing with a natural scale like meters when we build things, assuming you build that way, then it's a pretty good default. This is what happens under the hood, and then what it does is it then uses that mesh to help figure out what surfaces are facing up, like
Hmm.
basically what normals are pointed up, and from there you can imagine when this is in hubs and I do my teleport or I'm trying to walk around. Now I wouldn't be able to actually walk down these steps.
Right.
There's no
We'd have
ramp.
to teleport down them.
Yeah.
And this is not the final mesh there. Like there's still more steps that happen there. Then there's like this, it contracts the edges, and we'll talk about that with like the agent radius. And so like there's a few more steps beyond this, but like realizing that it's breaking your scene up into little cubes will kind of help start to understand what all the parameters are. There's like a billion different options, and it's there's a
Right.
lot.
And it's not
um,
without its flaws. I mean, one of the
yeah, yeah.
biggest, probably, I would say the biggest flaw with voxelizing a scene is that when you have primitives and shapes that are on not facing cardinal directions, in other words, not north, south, east, west, but like on diagonals, like in this picture, these steps, there's a higher likelihood that a step will fall, you know, outside of a
Hmm.
zone, like outside of a voxel.
Yeah,
And
it'll
so
get cut off, and yeah, it's like definitely an approximation.
can imagine
Um,
this from
there are
above, right? Like
right, yeah,
places
and
like
there
right
are other
here.
techniques to generate navigation meshes. This happens to be the one we use in Spoke, mostly because it's kind of pretty universal and works pretty well for lots of things. For specific scenes, there might be better ways to generate navigation meshes. And right now, we don't have like a great way for you to completely customize a navigation mesh, but that's something we're like looking into. Um, you know, Probably in the near future. I don't know exactly time frame, but you'll be able to like just in Blender directly say like this is my navigation mesh. Use this directly and generate it using some sort of Blender add-on or an external tool or just by hand if you wanted to. But the kind of stuff built into Spoke should help you with most kind of standard scenes, especially if you're like building with the architecture kit and Spoke like that. It actually does a pretty good job.
Yeah. So in this spoke scene that we were just in hubs, each one of these is a piece just snapped together. And so, everything is kind of built on grid for the most part, and there's not much to it other than the architecture kit. I have a few models, maybe from Sketchfab, like these lights and plants and things, but everything else is out of the kit. So if you haven't explored that, you can always find that down here under architecture kit, and things are categorized in helpful ways, hopefully, for all the different pieces that you could use. And of course, you can change their materials and things like that. But that's we've done some videos on that. You could look through the Mozilla Reality archive on our Mozilla Reality channel on YouTube, and you can go back and see some of our older videos on that. But once you've built a scene like this, typically what you do is you just say, okay, publish this to Hubs, and then open it up and walk around and hope everything is good. Um, but if you run into problems like, how come I can't walk up my stairs? Or like, I keep walking through a wall I didn't want to, or maybe I can't get through a door. Um, Now is when you need to come back and see what's actually going on here. And you can do that by going down to the item in the hierarchy called floor plan. It has these little footprints next to it. If you don't have a floor plan in your scene, you can find it under elements down here at the bottom. And if you scroll a little bit, there is one called floor plan, which doesn't show up right
I
now
think it's missing because you already have one.
because I
You can
have
only have
one.
one floor plan.
We
Yeah.
don't let you add another one, but it would be down here. I don't want to actually delete this one, so I'm going to leave it there. um, but if you want to see what it's actually doing at the current settings, and I've done a couple adjustments here, but not a lot, you can hit regenerate, and this will show you what it actually is doing. Now, the blue parts that you see, you might have guessed, are the actual places you're allowed to walk.
Yeah, that's the actual nav mesh that it generated.
And you can see that it got kind of close to these walls, but not all the way. If it got closer, your camera might clip through, or your avatar body might clip through, which could still happen, I guess, if you had a big like Kool-Aid Man avatar or something. But the you get an idea of how this works. Now you can see what it's doing on the steps right now, where it's generating this sort of ramp. Now it's not awesome. There are problems with it, and some of this comes about just with the way that this recast voxelization thing works. Like, for example, I would love it if the ramp stopped here, went down the stairs, and then picked up flat again. But that's not actually what it's doing. Like, you're seeing it's actually kind of starting to slope before the steps.
Mm-hmm.
And then something ugly is happening over here where it's like trying to get up around the corner of these steps, and so it's making kind of a steep wall here. And if you've ever had problems where you make a scene and then your avatar just stops dead in its tracks when you're trying to walk, it's usually because of something like this, where it's getting a little hung up on these edges. So like I said, not perfect, but most of the time these will work right out of the box. And
Yeah, I
be
mean,
okay.
what's nice is I think that most people probably who have made some scenes in Spoke might not have even ever looked at this, and that means that it's kind of doing its job, which is like we wanted it to just be a thing you don't really have to think about. The defaults should work pretty well for most scenes, and it just kind of gets out of the way. And I think we've mostly done that. There's definitely lots of edge cases, like you said here. It's not perfect, and if you wanted to tune it further, I mean, there's only so far you're going to get by tuning these parameters. So we definitely like for people who really want to take control over it, we want to make it so that you can kind of just manually override it completely. But yeah, like some common things you might run into with like the size of doorways and this sort of stuff, you can probably get away with adjusting some of these settings that we'll go over.
Well, let's talk about a couple of them. So one of the things
Yeah.
people ask sometimes is like, man, I really want to make it so you can only walk here and not walk here, right? Like, I don't want people to be able to teleport up onto my roof,
Mm-hmm.
right? That one's really simple. If your object isn't just one big object and it's made out of pieces like this one is, then it's pretty straightforward to go through and set parts of these to not generate floor plan on them. So I could go through each one of these pieces and find the ones that I don't want to generate floor plan on. By the way, you may hear me or Dom use the term floor plan and nav mesh interchangeably.
Yeah.
They're really the same thing. We just called
Floor
it
plan is kind of just the term we've used in Spoke, just to be a little bit less technical about it, and also kind
totally.
of to encompass the whole idea rather than the individual pieces.
So here it
But
is. I have this selected and I can choose. See, this is set to be walkable, which we do by default for these pieces because we didn't want people to have to think about it. But sometimes you want to turn it off. Now, if I
and it's actually a good idea to turn it off for anything. Even if you're not really having problems, it'll speed up the export time, and also prevent you from running into issues. Like sometimes I've seen people have problems where it'll go to export and it'll run out of memory or something like that, because it's too big.
especially
And
really
often
large
they'll have
scenes,
right, they'll have their skybox set to walkable or something like that, for example. And so then it's making this entire thing an nav mesh, and it has to like waste a whole bunch of time and memory and stuff, trying to figure out where you can walk on the sky, and obviously you just shouldn't be able to walk on the sky, so you should turn that off. And because we turn it on by default, people run into that, which is not great. But yeah, like turning it off on anything that doesn't need to be turned on for is useful.
Yeah, and bear in mind, you might be asking, like, what about all these little beams? Should I turn it off? Yeah, probably. But at the
Hmm.
same time, the settings of the floor plan are going to dictate how big an object has to be before it'll even consider generating on it. And so,
Right.
if it's not an issue, if you don't see floor plan being created somewhere you don't want, then just you can leave it alone. It's not a huge deal, unless you, like Dom said, you start running into memory problems and stuff. So I'm going to go back to the floor plan now. Here's what it was. In order to see the changes, I have to hit regenerate. And now it should not. I think I got all the roof pieces off. So if I hit regenerate, look at that. They're gone. You can no longer teleport up onto the roof of this pavilion.
And you may have wanted that, and maybe you want to leave like one panel of the roof still as a secret cool teleport area or something like that. But yeah,
Oh,
you
that's
have
true. Yeah, that's
full
actually
control over doing it.
kind of in the spirit of our grab bag today of tips. You can actually set a piece of mesh. Like for example, I could grab a piece of mesh like this floor block here, and I could duplicate it. I'm using Control D, and I could float it out here somewhere. Maybe that's too far. Whatever, I'll just slide it over here. And you could actually set it to be walkable, but turn off the visible flag.
Hmm.
Floor plan will still generate on that block, and only you will know about it, unless somebody is moving their teleporter around and trying to find secret areas. But anyway, that's kind of cool. If you're ever looking for just like a vantage point of a scene, or like, I don't know. Am I actually just giving people tips on trolling? That's probably not a good idea. But it is what it is. You can try different things. Selecting an invisible thing's a little harder, but I think that guy got
And
added down here.
there's also, I think in Spook, I forget what the element is called, but there's a way to create like a non-walkable area, um, specifically.
You can use
Remember
a
how to do that?
box collider
Right. Yeah.
like this. This is just an invisible box, and you could use it the same way. If you set it as
It's like the opposite. So like that'll cut out a hole there
yeah,
in that mesh.
but it may generate on top, so you have to be mindful of how you use these.
Oh,
But,
does it?
well,
That's
it could,
interesting.
yeah, because it's just like an invisible block,
Okay.
as far as I
You
know.
can make it. You
I'm
can
not
make it
sure.
taller or something like
Let's
that. Well, let's see what it does. I don't remember.
yeah,
Um, but
can't
like certainly, if you set the height, because you can set out the height limit for things, and so you can make it really.
no, it
Okay,
didn't
that doesn't
generate
do
on
that.
top. Maybe
Oh, yeah,
it's
there
too
we go. Yeah,
small, but yeah, I just carved out a section of nav mesh. So
yeah.
if you
And so there may
found
be
like,
things you want to do that way too.
hmm and that's a really handy thing. I think a lot of people don't realize these colliders exist. But the other thing to be aware of is that this collider will now cause like your objects to bump into them, like rubber ducks and things like
Hmm.
that. So yeah, but in a pinch, you could try using one of those if you're having difficulty getting the nav mesh to shape the way you want. I'm going to go back and turn. I'm going to go back to the nav mesh settings now and talk a little bit about the floor plan and how to do things. Like, so one of the couple of big questions, the big ones we get all the time, and I don't know if you're monitoring any questions coming in, if anybody's
Yeah, I'm watching chat,
us,
but
but often people say, I can't get close enough to my wall, or I'm getting too close to the wall and I want to not be able to because I'm clipping through it. That is a setting that is called agent. Now, whenever you see the word agent in here, that refers to like avatars, the agents.
yeah, and we're using the terms basically directly from the underlying library we're using, which is called Recast. That's used to generate the nav meshes. So we just kept their terminology because if you want to actually go deep and look into this stuff, you probably should look at the documentation for Recast and like kind of go into that stuff. And so we kind of just kept those terms the same so that it'll be easier to look that stuff up.
Yeah, you don't have to be like, oh, like wall closeness means
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
agent
Exactly.
Yeah, we didn't want to do
Yeah.
that. So, in order to make things closer to the wall, your agent radius, you can think of it as like how wide is my avatar. It needs to be smaller. So I set it to, I think 0.2 is our default. We determined that was like 0.2 meters is the radius that we use as a default, but I'm going to change it to say 0.1 or maybe 0.05 or something, and we'll see a difference when I hit regenerate. Watch the edge of this floor and around the fountain here. Should get closer. Yeah, so it got pretty close. In fact,
Hmm.
it's doing
Now
some.
you see it kind of clipping. Oh,
Yeah,
actually, never
it's
mind.
doing.
That's it. It's raised up there.
It's just this ugly artifact from the ramp.
Hmm.
So
I mean, I think it
yeah,
might actually be those little ledges, those little the moldings, maybe
yep,
causing it to do that. Because if that happens to fall inside of a voxel, it's going to be like, okay, well, that's raised up there, and so, um,
yeah. We could try 0.1 and just see. Boy, that's virtually the same.
yeah. And I mean, a lot of this will just come down to a little bit of trial and error and kind of artistic intent. Like, what do you want? Where do you want people to be able to walk? Um, Generally, the defaults like work pretty well for the size environments and avatars we have. But if you have a particularly narrow doorway or something like that, the agent radius plus other settings might make it such that you can't fit through that doorway anymore.
Yeah. By the way, if you totally screw these up and you're like, oh my god, I don't even know what the original settings are. Worst case scenario, just delete the floor plan and add a
Hmm.
new one, and
Yeah, it'll go
it'll
back to
have
defaults. Yeah.
yeah. So the other big question that people ask, aside from how close I can get to things, is the stairs. Right now, I made these stairs in the architecture kit. They were designed to just kind of work with our default settings, and so they pretty much always generate a nice ramp. But once in a while, somebody comes in and decides they know better than I do, and they decide they're gonna, like scale them maybe non-uniformly or something, and
Hmm.
and they make them like extra tall or something. They want to build something like this, and they make it too tall, and then when they go to generate the floor plan again, it might not see this as a viable ramp. Like
Well, that one's still most actually, yeah, it cuts off there
cuts off there
at the
because
top.
this is too small up here. That's another
Right.
setting. But if you run into something like that, let's see.
Or like the opposite, where people are able to climb something up, that you didn't want them to be able to climb. Like you had some mountains kind of at the edges or something, and you wanted that to be not something where people could go.
Steep
Um,
wall, yeah,
right. Like you wanted that to be like you can adjust the settings the opposite direction to make sure that they can't climb up things.
yeah. And so
And I forget what the settings
the
called, but
setting for things like ramps and steps of any sort is right here, and it's called the maximum step height. And
mhm.
what that means is this is essentially saying what is the maximum between one level and another that I will as I'm voxelizing this, like, am I going to go that counts as connected to each
Right.
other. So
Anything taller than that will be considered okay. Like this is actually another floor. This is a separate. This is a completely separate area.
right, and so like from this ground down here all the way up to this ground would be too big. If there were no stairs here, it would not generate a ramp
Mhm.
between them. But if I raise this maximum step height up a lot, it might actually try to bridge the gap between those two floors.
Yeah, like I think, for example, if you got rid of the stairs and
Let's kill
then
it.
made the height,
Well, I need
oh,
another.
actually, well, there's no floor there, but yeah, just
I'm
copy
gonna
a piece of floor into there.
let's just
Um,
put a little.
and then you made the maximum step height, like I don't know, what is that, like 2 meters or something? um,
Yeah,
then
it's
I
pretty
think
high.
it would try to bridge the ramp.
So let me
Um,
regenerate now.
Now this might break some other stuff too, but
There. So no, it cannot connect those. But if I raise this max step height, which is probably going to be insane, but if I raised it to like 2 meters,
yeah,
it should, yeah, see it bridge the gap. Now, if you see it clip like that, it's actually going through. You just can't. The way we
yeah.
visualize it is not the best, but
Yeah, I mean the nav mesh will kind of clip into the geometry like that. You probably won't notice it in hubs because it's just kind of where your feet are, and so you won't really notice that. But no, I mean obviously this setting is probably not something you'd want to do in general because it's probably going to cause other issues. Having that big of a step height is probably going to
yeah, if I didn't have
you're not going to
stairs,
notice.
I would sooner grab one of those invisible boxes and make a ramp out of it, and
Yeah,
then
yeah,
do it
or
that
put
way.
an invisible set of stairs just to like have that be the ramp.
there it is at 1 meter, so it's not high enough to go, right? But
But you
my
do see it bridges like onto some of those, like
the
halfway up the stair
totally.
there. It bridges up to that because it's like, okay, that's still a step.
And if you lower that too low, like if this was at say zero point 0.1 or something, and I hit regenerate, you end up with no steps because it says, oh, this first step is more than zero point 0.1, so
Right.
I can't bridge a gap between this floor
And
and
then
that
the
floor.
top surface of that step is too small to be considered its own ground area, so then you end up getting nothing there.
Yeah. So if I raise it to say point, I'm trying to get like a kind of mediocre one. 0.15 might be enough. Nope. Zero point 0.2 is really my magic number here. Yep, that was enough. Sort of. Look, it got a little confused right there.
Yeah.
I don't remember. What did I have it at? 0.5. I think that was my setting before. Yep, 0.5 was pretty good. Um, and if you're not sure about like how tall these steps are and things, you can always try to use your grid as a guide by setting your grid to different settings. Like if you set it to 1 meter, then the ground grid, each square is 1 meter. And as you change that smaller, like here's 1/4 of a meter, then you might be able to measure things a little more granularly. Or likewise, if you're trying to see how big a scene is, sometimes I set it higher, and you can actually type in your own values here. So I can type in like 10,
Hmm.
and now it says custom 10 meters. So now each grid square is a whole 10 meters, which somebody yesterday asked the question like, how do I know how big my scene is? And it was some really giant scene.
Right.
And I suggested they turn it up to like 10 or more, and then just count the squares. They could go, oh, okay, it's like 10, 20. So this is almost 20 meters this way and 20 meters that way. It's kind of a square.
And so I think one other thing worth going over before we move on to like a completely different topic, but like is like the cell size. So like the idea of like how big are these cubes it's breaking the scene up into, because that can affect how like the level of detail. I mean, so this because you're using the architecture kit, I think the pieces are not that intricate. They're relatively simplified, which is good.
Chunky.
But if you had kind of some details that were getting cropped out of your scene, the floor plan of your scene, one thing you could do is try to decrease the cell size. But as you decrease that, the time it takes to generate the nav mesh and the memory it takes and all that goes up significantly because it's having to break up the scene into even more and more pieces. So there's kind of limits to how small you can realistically
Yeah.
make that without you know
I mean, at
breaking your
the
computer.
current settings, I don't actually think we let you go too much smaller than this. But at the current settings, I mean, you're getting the granularity of say like these. Look
Mhm.
at that little corner in there. It cut
But
out.
if you like bump up the cell size, for example, you'll see that
Like
corner
if I made it
basically will
point
like go away.
0.5 instead, and then hit regenerate, like now it's this kind of sloppy, blah blah blah.
Right.
Just a rough.
And like honestly,
Think of
that's
it like
still probably
resolution.
fine for this. Yeah, it's the resolution of the little that that graphic you showed before. It's how big those cubes are that it's breaking the scene up into. Um, and you'll see like here you're now starting to miss some stuff that you would have wanted. Um,
But I might have been able to
like
get away with like 0.25 instead of
right.
whatever I had 0.12.
Yeah, and the bigger you can make this, the faster it'll be to generate the nav mesh. And so, this it does regenerate every time if you've modified stuff, every time you re-export the scene, it regenerates the nav mesh, and so that takes some time. And so, if you want to cut that time down, making the cell size bigger will help. But obviously, it's a trade-off.
And also it can be misleading, like I said before. Like you're like, oh look, this is messed up. It's not actually. This is actually connected here. It's just the geometry is hiding it.
Hmm.
But those meshes are actually connected together. I wish I had a better way to show that, other than to
If you hide the stairs, that might
yeah, I'd have to hide it and then go
go back
back
to
to
the
floor plan. I'm
floor
not going to
plan.
bother with all that. But
Yeah,
you guys get the point. And then Dom mentioned earlier, like if you had some more organic terrain or something like a hill, the setting that would help you there is the maximum slope. You
hmm
may find that like a really steep slope is still generating nav mesh, and you could lower this number because this is in degrees. Like a 60-degree slope is too much, and it would anything 60 or below right now it would generate a slope on. So I could demonstrate that by grabbing, say, one of these floor pieces.
Yeah, and the difference between the slope height and the step height stuff. So I mean, the steps is when you have like discrete pieces of mesh, like they're separate faces that are at different heights. The step height is about merging those into things. So, like you would have in steps. The slope height is like, okay, you have a single face or some some number of faces that are at some angle, and it's setting which angle should I consider to be walkable. Um, so they're related set, or like they're kind of have similar effect in some ways, but they're different settings for that.
Yeah, so like if I rotate this now, I'm going to set my snap settings at like 10 degrees. So I'm going to count as I rotate 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. So that's a 50-degree slope,
Mm-hmm.
about, I would say. And I'm gonna just scale this up. Like, whoa, not that big. Way too big. Okay, so like something like that. Just so we can see, like, what if that was a drawbridge or something and I didn't
Right.
want it to generate on there. Right now, because this is about a 50-degree slope and the setting is at 60, it will generate on there. As
Mm-hmm.
far as I,
As long as it's walkable.
it is, but it didn't. Fail. What did I do wrong? Let's. It could also be related to step height, but let's see if let me lower this a bit. Regenerate. No, it's still not. Am I taking crazy pills, Tom?
Um, why is that not working?
Oh, wait, no. Because I'm lowering the number, it's not going to generate. I have to go higher.
Oh yeah.
But I would have
But you
thought
had it
that
at 50 and it was at 60, so I think that.
it's still not working. Can't really go much beyond like 90 degrees. Welcome to real-time troubleshooting. Oh, look, it generated it over here.
Oh, weird.
I'm ultra confused. Let's put it back to 50 and watch it again. Yeah, 50 is still working there. But as I lower it, it should stop doing that. Yeah, see, now it's starting to go, oh, that's too steep for me.
Yeah, not sure why it's generating on that side and not the other side. Um,
Unless it is and I just can't see it. That's
that's also
a
possible.
possibility. Like, it's just not drawing. Like if I go back to this guy.
It might also be because it's considering it might be generating on the one face, and then it's like, okay, well, these are now too close to each other, and they're considered, you know,
some max
like
angle
like
between them.
typically if you had some terrain, like if we go look at the crater scene, I think that'll
that's
be
a good idea.
easier way to demonstrate this.
Okay, I'm gonna go just make a new project, a new scene with the crater. Take your time. What is happening? Okay, let's just go to crater. Okay. You still there, Dom?
I am.
All right. So if I look at the floor plan, this by default is set walkable. I look at the floor plan that gets generated here, and it's big. It takes longer. And on a weaker computer, you might run out of memory. But let's see. That's a lot of terrain, right? I could walk pretty much everywhere on here. But as I lower the maximum slope, it should.
Yeah, and this is a good example. Like you might not want people to walk up there.
Yeah.
So in this scene, you could even lower it quite, like really low, like this.
Or
And
even
now you'll only be able to walk on.
even like 2. If I set it to 2 degree, I think this
Yeah,
only
it should
this
only be
flat
the inner
area,
area, which might be kind of what you wanted for this scene, depending on what you were doing with it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. So
There's a couple little things out here, but no, not
yep,
too bad.
and I suspect again, like that's just cutting through the terrain. So if you hide the terrain, I think that's probably might be one continuous piece, but I can't tell.
Let's see. I'll hide it, and then I'll go back to floor plan. It should show it. A couple
Yeah.
got connected.
Yeah, there's a little bit. Yeah, because there's some mountains in there. But anyway, yeah, it doesn't have to be perfect either, because like you're not just going to end up walking onto those pieces of there. You can teleport onto them, which is a little weird.
And actually, depending on how far away those little islands are, your teleporter might not even reach them.
Right. But like I said, I think we want to make it so that you can, if you want to take ultimate control over this and be very precise and do that. We want to make it so that you can specify your own mesh, but that's not available yet.
Yep.
One trick you can do if you want something kind of in between, and want to be able to do it right now, if you make a mesh that you kind of want to act as the navigation mesh, bring that into Spoke, and then have that be the only thing you mark as walkable. It will generate the navigation mesh from that. It's still doing the voxelization and stuff, and so you're still going to get those sorts of issues, but it'll get you closer to precise control. Um, but yeah, I think it shouldn't actually be too hard to support completely custom navigation meshes. So that's probably something we'll do relatively.
Here's an example, not a great one, but at one point I was trying to make. Let's see if I can find it. I may not even have this scene anymore. Oh, is this like war memorial? I found this photogrammetry, and I was like, oh, would this? This was actually before our Mozilla Berlin trip, and this is somewhere in Berlin, and I was like, oh, this would be neat. This is actually huge. Like a person in this scene in real life, I mean, those are people right there. They're really little.
Right.
So this is a really big thing. Now, there's not a ton of detail, but I didn't want people to be able to like walk up on these trees because they're just mesh. They're just a piece of mesh.
Yeah,
and
this is like a photogrammetry scan.
So in this, I made a separate mesh, and I exported it as a GLB from Blender, and this is what the other mesh actually looks like. Just sitting on top. It's like a cone in a ground and a couple little cutout parts around the edges of the trees.
Right, and now that isn't your navigation mesh because we don't have the ability to literally specify that as your mesh.
Right.
That would be nice, like because that is a nice navigation mesh, as is. But then if you look at the floor plan, the thing that gets generated is going to be kind of based just on that.
Yeah, so if I turn the main mesh back on, that one is not set walkable. You can't generate nav mesh on this whole thing. Only my special one. And so that one is hidden. And then the floor plan says, okay, I'll generate it even on your hidden stuff. And so when it's done, what you end up with is a pretty clean floor plan that's just cut out around these trees. And a bit of a cone that goes up on a nice slope. So that's like one really simple example. It's not that fun to build your own floor plan, but it can be very satisfying when you get a better result than you got from like this heavy mesh. Because I think this photogrammetry mesh is, if I look at the GLTF,
it's probably kind of nuts. Yeah.
Yeah, it's got 48,000 triangles, so that's quite a bit. Not unheard of, but once you get into photogrammetry stuff with like millions of triangles, then you got problems. So you might want to make your own. So that is floor plan in a nutshell. If you guys have any questions, feel free to send them our way. When you get into more complex scenes, what I found is that in scenes like this. Probably, like I said in the beginning, probably the biggest errors you run into happen to be with oblique angles, like things that are not straight on the grid. And now that you know how the voxelization works under the hood, that kind of gives you some insight into that. So plan accordingly or adjust accordingly. But like in here, for example, at first, some of these angles, even though they're just little steps, caused me problems. And I think the only error I have in here now when I run in hubs is, for whatever reason, this step going into this room. There's like one of those weird artifacts I was talking about where like it, I don't know what I'm getting hung up on over here. I think it's like this little corner right here or something. But I could probably make some adjustments. Oh, one other thing now that I'm remembering. Somebody also asked this week about this setting called agent height. Why does the height matter? And that's a really good question because we know the radius, the thickness of the avatar essentially is how close the mesh gets to the wall. But the height is think of it almost like the opposite of the step height. It's like saying, how low does a thing have to be, like this door frame, before it blocks out the nav mesh? below.
Right, and this can affect too. Like if you want to have multiple floors,
Yes.
that second floor has to be above this height. Otherwise, it's going to just kind of be considered part of the first floor, and then you're just going to be overlapping, and then the lower part won't have nav mesh, but the upper part will.
And you go to teleport, and then you feel like you went through the ground or like to the
Mhm.
lower floor or something. So if this agent height isn't high enough, if it's say like, let's say this was at like, zero point 0.3 meters or something, and I hit regenerate, we might lose any connections in our doorways.
Or if the agent height is
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 it
too tall,
too
because
tall?
yeah,
Yeah,
because then you're going to end up
there it
thinking
is.
that the upper part of the doorway is actually part of uh, is part of the floor, and so you're gonna there's gonna be nav mesh on top of the doorway. I think if you look,
I think that's what happened. Yep. I think
um,
it generated. Well, it might be too skinny to do that, but it definitely
yeah,
lost this
that's true.
connection, so that the
Yep.
number was too high. So again, the default, which we have is at 1.7, is pretty good for at least for this architecture kit. It works quite well. But you may find if you're bringing in your own kit pieces or you're bringing in your own model, depending on how it was built and what the scale is, you might have to make some adjustments. Now you see, like in here, it didn't generate anything on the shelves. And that's another setting. That's like the minimum region area. Like
Hmm.
how big, how small, or how big does a region have to be before it's considered like I don't count. Like
And like that also takes into account the agent radius, because remember that the if it's a separate island, that's going to have the agent radius applied to it, so it might even be small. Like the shelf is going to be then contracted by the agent radius, and then what's left there is what gets compared to the minimum size. And so like if that ends up being smaller, then the whole thing just gets discarded.
yeah, things like these curves can be tricky for it to work out
Hmm.
because it just sort of makes a mound out of it. But most of the time, like you said, because your avatar doesn't have legs and you're not looking at IK,
Hmm.
feet hitting the ground at
Yeah, you
precise
mostly don't even
spots.
really notice, or you can't tell very much. I mean, like that would be an example of like if you wanted that to be something you had to teleport onto, that would be you would adjust your step height, um, such that like that wouldn't be considered a smooth step, and then then you'd have to teleport onto it,
Yeah, I would bring
and
it
so
way down, and then it wouldn't generate
you would bring it. Uh,
like that.
yeah, there. Yeah, exactly.
So that was at point one. But now I may have messed up like some of my
Other
other
steps,
other
exactly.
steps
Yeah,
out here. So,
yeah. Unfortunately, it's all or nothing with this thing, but
but you get it.
cool. I'll also link in chat. There's a GDC talk from last year. Unfortunately, I think it's only Vault access. So
We
unless
don't
you
we don't
unless
have
you have GDC
permission to
Vault,
show it, but
but I'll link it anyway in case you do have GDC Vault. It was kind of a talk by the Havoc Physics people about different techniques for generating nav meshes and that sort of stuff, and they go over recast in pretty fine detail, which was actually super helpful, because it kind of happened to be we were looking at this stuff at that time too. Um, Cool. So I think we're like a little over halfway. So if we move, I don't know the other thing you
here's
wanted to
here's a
discuss.
maze. That one is a challenge for it to generate,
Oh
but it
yeah,
but it actually works quite well, except for the fact that you can get on top of the maze here. But um, I
that's
could.
good for cheating.
Yeah, it's good for
So
cheating. Anyway, we're going to totally shift topics, sort of back to one that we did last week. Was it last week we talked about UV scroll, or was it the week before? It was the week before.
forget.
And the week before last, I showed a hubs room that we had set up, where we showed some examples. And the hubs room, if I can find it, it's in my favorites, was called UV scrolling. And this UV scrolling room is kind of a nice demonstration of all the things that UV scrolling could do, or at least it was until Dom added some new features, and I didn't update it. And so since then, I've added his new cool stuff. And the new cool stuff in this case is treating a scrolling texture not just like a plain scroll like this, but there is a setting on the UV scroll for an increment. And an increment basically means that you could take a sheet of images, for example, uh, like this, like a walk cycle or a something like this. This is a eight images of a cat running, were drawn, right? And you can tell it to increment through sections of the texture. So it's all one texture, but we can say move whole chunks at a time in order to
Yeah, and
show.
it's still using the normal UV scrolling stuff. Like all the scroll settings that you used before still apply, but now instead of moving continuously through the texture, like we do by default, you can set an increment, and that'll kind of snap to specific points.
So it essentially is like flipbook mode.
Mhm.
So this is a flipbook of Fire that was provided by, I think it was on the Unity website, and they provided these for free, just for testing out their feature. They have a similar feature, and so this is just one object. It is just one plane with its UVs taking up just a tiny corner here in the texture, and then it's flipping through all of them over time. And you can
And this is way cheaper than a video. It's just moving a single offset in the shader. So it's way cheaper than a video and way cheaper than like a mesh animation or something like that if you were to do that.
Yeah,
Um,
before this,
and
we would have to use a GIF, especially if you wanted
yeah,
transparency like this, and they were like killing
extra
people on,
expensive.
on mobile,
Yeah.
killing people on headsets sometimes, especially like Quest and things.
Now, I suspect there's probably other things you can do with this. I mean, the reason I didn't just implement it as like another component that was like flipbook or whatever, or sprite sheet, and maybe we'll still do that because these values are kind of hard to figure out what you're supposed to set them to. But I suspect there's probably other things you can do with this. I don't know what they are, but like that disco floor thing, for example, I think you can do that with this technique too, and maybe even different. Um, I haven't really thought through what exactly you might be able to do with this, but all it's doing is just taking the normal UV scroll thing you do, and then rather than continuously smoothly scrolling through it, it just snaps it to certain increments. And so I'm
Well,
betting
I can
there's
think.
probably
I mean,
some
I
other
can think of
interesting things you
stuff
can do
like
with
if I
this. Yeah.
wanted this to play a certain pattern,
Hmm.
like like little shapes or like very specific like light patterns or something. That would be better to do with this flipbook method.
Well, sure. Yeah, I'm just wondering if there's something that's not just things laid out in a sprite sheet sort of thing
Mm.
that you might be able to end up doing with this, especially because you can control them independently. So I don't know. I don't know what it is, but
Well,
um,
let me show a little bit about how this is set up.
yeah.
The first step is finding a sprite sheet like this. Now today, I found a bunch of them on a website called pngwave.com. They happen to have a lot of, when I did a search in here, they were all like transparent PNGs, which was awesome because now you may find some from old games, or you may find some from like Mario and things like that. Well, what is this one? It's like a bear. Looks kind of awesome. Um, but a lot of times that the sprite sheets that you find that somebody else has already made are not set up for like a continuous cycle. They're more like multiple cycles, like here's the jump, here's the run, here's the punch, or whatever. But you can still use it, especially if it's divided up in such a way that they're just strips. Because you could say, similar to what I did in this one, this is a long image, and it's just going on the x-axis. There's no multiple rows or anything like
Mhm.
that. But I'll explain in a minute how that works. So in the case of, say, this guy, what I did was I found the image and I downloaded it. And I noticed that it is 8 images that cycle. And so we have to set it up a certain way to do that. So what I'm going to do is go into Blender here, and I gotta switch my thing over here, don't I?
And while you're
Let's go to
switching,
Blender.
someone in chat was asking if there would be a way to set it up so that a user could trigger, flipping through the frames. It's not something we have right now, but we've talked about having, some sort of basic triggers and interactivity that we can, put into Spoke, and that would be a good example of something you could do. Yeah, like when you click this thing or when you enter this space, set the UV offset of a thing like that. Those are kinds of simple things that you can probably do a lot with. So that would be pretty cool.
Yeah. So what I do is I start out with a square plane like this, and I just leave it at the origin because this is going to help me, get the. I don't know. I came up with my own way of doing this. Your mileage may vary. You may find a better way to do this, by the way, there are also a number of add-ons for both like Photoshop and also for Blender to render out an animation into a sprite sheet. I'd encourage you, if you have your own animation and you want to turn it into something like that, take a look. The Blender community is amazing, and they always have really cool add-ons. A lot of them free. So,
And since these are just GLTF files, if someone wants to make a little tool that
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 does this,
you put in a sprite
yeah,
sheet and set some values and it spits out a GLTF file, that'd be really
I'm all
really
for
fun.
it. And we will promote it, and we may even give you a shout out here. I'm sure we will. So what I'm going to do is just make a quick material for this. So I'm okay with just the principal BSDF shader that happens by default when you make a new material. But what I am going to do is add an image texture and find that image that I made. Now I don't know if you can see what I have up right now, but I'm just going to navigate to my pictures, and I had this guy. It was called Flipbook Walk. And I'm going to plug it in just to the color. And now you're going to see it's all wrong because this image is actually a weird dimension. This image happens to be, and a way to know in here, a quick way to find out what the image dimensions are is if you go to the editor that's called, that we're in right now, it's the image editor. You can go to this little hamburger menu, choose image. I have to first get the
And then I
image
assume
loaded.
the default UVs on the plane in Blender are just going to be 0 to 1 in the corners.
Yeah.
So it's going to span the entire image no matter what.
It's just stretching it across the whole thing. But if you go to if you load the image up in here in the little drop down, and then go to image resize, it'll actually just tell you what it is. So it's a 1024 by 256 image.
Mm-hmm.
Now, full disclosure, it was not that size when I downloaded it. It was like a little bigger than that, but it was not powers of 2. And game engines and rendering engines like powers of 2. So if you can,
yeah, it's not strictly required. It'll kind of get converted at runtime if you don't do it, but it's better if you can. If you're authoring the content anyway, you might as well try to make it a power of 2.
So there it is. There it is in the UV editor. And over here, let me go into this textured mode so I can see it. And what I'm looking at now is not what I want. Now, here's what I did to get this stretched out to the right size. And like I said, you may do it a different way. One way you could do it is to go in the UV editor and just start like moving this until it looks right. But what I actually need is my plane to be a rectangle, not a square. So here's what I did. I knew how many sprites it was divided into. And so what I did was I go into edit mode and I hit Control R, and that will give you, when you roll over an edge, like the tool that will split, that'll cut the mesh. And so when I click once and then move, I could like divide it up. Now, a better way to do it would be to say Control R, and then before I click at all, roll your mouse cursor forward, and it'll divide it up in the number of times you want. So I actually did it into 8 like that. And then I right click, and now I've got it.
But your height is not going to be, it's not the same aspect ratio.
Height's not right. So what I'm going to do is an easy way to get the height right, since I know it's a 1024 by 250. 256 goes into 1024 4 times, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm going to do Control R again and split this one up 4 times.
Right.
Like that. And now I know one of these corners is the right size. Mm-hmm. And so this is kind of lame, but I just selected the corner and then I hit Control I to select the opposite, and I deleted them. And then
you could probably also scale it.
You could scale it
as well.
Yep. I'm just tinkering, and
whatever works.
This is how I do it. And so I did that, and then I just got to get it to the pivot point. So first I got out of edit mode, I should say. I went to object, set origin, and then I set it to the center of mass or the center of volume. Doesn't matter, it's flat. So now the pivot is there, and now I can just move it back with Shift S and then selection to cursor. And now it's down there in the middle. So now this is the right size, but its UVs are wrong.
UVs, right.
So all I have to do now is just pull these down to the bottom. and then it's the right size. And if you're really being particular, you could open up and like,
Yeah, I mean, you could just set, I mean, you know exactly what the value should be. So,
yeah,
like, the bottom ones should be at one for the vertical dimension, and then the horizontal dimension should just be, one over the or divide the number of sprites.
yeah.
I don't know how many are there.
So that's how I did it. There's 8 total.
Okay, yeah, so one or eight.
Now that math will actually come in handy when we add the component to it. So this is
Hmm.
pretty much done. Now it's not going to be transparent yet. And if you're wondering how to do that, you got to do 2 things here. This image does have alpha, as you can see the checker background here. So we can plug the alpha output here into the alpha of this shader node. So I can plug that into alpha. Now it will be transparent, but not quite yet. You have to open up the settings over here under options and set the blend mode not to opaque, but to alpha clip. Now you could use alpha blend if it had all kinds of soft transparency,
and
but it's more expensive.
the difference between those two is just going to be like alpha clip is on or off. So it's going to say like, okay, set some threshold. You set the value, and then anything below that threshold is just going to be completely transparent. Anything above will be completely opaque.
This
what's
has
nice
a
about
slider
this,
because I can if
yeah,
it has an ugly edge like this, I can play with the slider and kind of trim it a little bit until it looks smoother.
and if you can get away with using clip, it's better, both because it's cheaper, but also you're going to run into less of those issues with. I think we've talked about this maybe in the past, but like overlapping transparency. If you have multiple objects that are alpha blend and they're overlapping each other, you can get some weird artifacts where you see them cut out incorrectly or you see through them like you weren't expecting to. Unfortunately, that's like really hard problem to solve in a generic way.
Yep.
The best way you can do is like if your assets can support alpha clip and you can do that, use alpha clip. Only use blending when you actually have semi-transparent things or gradients or shadows or something like that where you actually need to have the in between transparency.
But even that fire one that I showed in Hubs, I mean, had all kinds of smooth alpha on it. I just set it to alpha clip, and
yeah, I mean that would
it looks
look
pretty
better
good.
with blend, and if you want to do that, that's fine too. That you just have to be aware of when you're using it to make sure not to overlap it and that sort of stuff.
Also, bear in mind you can turn on backface culling here so that it would not draw the back of this if you were looking at it from the other side. In the case of a 2-dimensional looking sprite in Hubs, I'm cool with seeing both sides. In fact, it'd be kind of cool. That way I could like move it around and face it the other way if I wanted. Simulate a crowd. I don't know. There's a lot of cool things.
This
you
could be
do
a
with
fun
this.
avatar also.
Oh man, somebody could make an awesome like crowd scene, kind of like the way they used to do them in like old EA games, like Madden and stuff. Like have a crowd of sprite people that are like cheering in the background. But anyway, this should work fine. The one thing I do want to do before I export this, or actually I still have to set up the scroll component, but it is a little bit shiny, and so if in Hubs there's a light. Not only will you see the shininess on the surface here, you might see it on the transparent part. It depends on how the shader works, but just turn the roughness all the way up so that so you don't end up with this glossy.
Can you use the background shader with alpha in Blender? I forget.
I don't think so.
I don't think it has an alpha input.
It doesn't have an alpha input, and I wish it did. So that's kind of a bummer. But there are probably ways of using a mix shader to combine transparency in that, but at that point it may not be cheap anymore, so this is okay. Now, I can't just do what we did in a previous tutorial where I go to it and I add a component called UV scroll, set a number, and be done with it. Because if I set this to have like a speed of 1 or something, what it's going to actually do, I won't bother showing in Hubs, but what it'll actually do is just scroll this like this.
Yeah, it'll just continuously scroll through, and so you'll see the scenes, which is a cool effect in and of itself.
If I do it fast enough, that's not quite what I want. So there's this other setting, and this is really what we're interested in showing today. Underneath speed is increment. And so it's like, how much do you want this UV to slide?
In what increments?
In each step, yeah. And so I'm going to leave the speed at 1, only on X. There is no Y. It's never going to go to another row. So this is actually a really easy one. The increment is the tricky part. And really what I do is I just say, well, how many steps is it, right? So this is 8 steps. So I need 1/8. So the nice thing about Blender is you can actually go over to this as if you were going to type a number and instead type 1 divided by 8, enter, and that's the number I need. So it's actually rounding it. It's 0.125, but it's rounding it to 0.13. And now
I think it might even just be showing the rounded number.
Yeah. It's actually, when I click on it, it says 0.125. So
Yep.
That's good to know when you look in the UV scroll example, because it says 1.3. It might be confusing. But that's it. That's all I need to do is add that one component to this mesh. The only thing I'll do is actually just slide it up so that it's kind of on the ground. I did that in edit mode so that the pivot stays at the ground. And this guy will animate when I export him. So I'm going to go ahead and export him as a GLB. And I'm not actually going to do it because I already did it. But then I just drag and drop it in here and it works. And if you want him to run faster or walk faster, just set the speed higher. So if I set this speed to 2 and export him, let me go to, where am I exporting him? I'll export him in the same place that I did the other one. So I'll go to I have a little directory called Flipbook. Let's call this Flipbook Walk 2, and make sure my hubs components are on. I know you can't see everything I'm doing right now because it doesn't pop up, but let me switch now over to here. So this was the original. That's basically what I just made at a speed of 1, just like this. Now, this guy that I'm about to drop in is the same exact thing going at a speed of 2. So he's the same, but it's just playing through faster.
Yep.
Which is kind of neat if you want to make a crowd and they were moving at different speeds. But they're using the same texture, so it's not really any more expensive.
Right, exactly. Yeah, multiple instances of this are still using the same texture. So.
And if you wanted to make a crowd, you might want to consider putting multiple people on one sheet in different rows, and then you could just move your UVs to that row, set it exactly the same, maybe a slightly different speed, and
yeah. No, I mean, like if you made a crowd out of this, like it's still, if you did it in this way, it would still be multiple
draw calls.
But if you made it a single mesh in Blender, you could do it all in one draw call and have them all kind of animating differently based on just using the different UV coordinates. Like put them in a different point in the UV space, and you could have like 3 different rows of crowd people, and still just animate the offset only on the horizontal axis, and then have just based on how you set the UVs for each of those things, have them be completely different, characters or whatever.
So here's like that one of those cat ones I did earlier. That's only 8 images, not bad. Be nice if it were smoother. Oh, that also made me realize that if you did them all on one sheet, like multiple people, they don't all have to have the same division. Like you could have a smoother one on a different row that was divided up into smaller increments, as long as you set it appropriately.
If you'd have to use different meshes with different UV scroll components, and if they were using the same texture, that actually wouldn't work because the animation, the UV offset is per texture, and so you can't use
that's
the same
right.
texture with different UV offsets.
You'll
get a little warning in the console about it if you try to. It just only uses it'll use the animation value from the first one.
And then so just to show you can do some interesting things, give you guys out there some ideas. I took the same cat one, and let me go back to Blender really quick just so you can see it. But in Blender, I did this one of the cat, and before I exported it, I just moved the mesh away from its pivot point over here, and then I animated it moving in a circle, so it just does a loop in a couple seconds. I think it's like 4 seconds, or maybe 3, 6, 9, 12. Yeah, it's like 4-second loop. But the flipbook is still going to play while it's doing that, and so when I go back into hubs or spoke, depending on where I'm putting it. And then I drop it in. Now I have this one that runs in a circle around the scene. And the bigger
That's
I make
cool.
it, the bigger the circle is, I guess. It's a little crooked right now because
Tilt.
placing it is tricky. This is where we need your new thing, Dom.
Yeah.
But if I were to, try to rotate that flat,
It's really hard.
it is really hard because I don't have a frame reference. I should have put something in the middle that it was circling.
A little ball or something.
Yeah. But this is kind of cool. I mean, you could make some really, kind of like when I was showing this one of stuff scrolling by like that. You could do a combination of things scrolling and then like maybe a bird that was flapping and moving, or another car driving by or something, a person running by. I don't know. Make a pretty interesting scene out of it. And like we said before, this one is using this flame is using alpha clip also, so it doesn't have a lot of semi-transparency or anything, but it's still pretty effective, especially from far away. Like if you wanted to make little sconces on the wall with fire burning, something like that. Campfire in the distance, jets on an airplane, or a
and then you combine
flamethrower.
that with the particle system stuff we have in Spoke, and you can do lots of cool little things. It'd be nice if we actually made the particles themselves UV scrollable as well. We don't have that as a feature yet, but that'd be cool.
We're starting to get all these different components, and as we
being
go
able
on,
to combine them together. I mean, that's like I said,
Yeah.
that's why the way I implemented this increment thing is I didn't specifically make it about sprite books. I still suspect that there's something I'm not thinking about, or that we're not thinking about, that you'll be able to use this increment thing in a surprising way. And I bet if we, go dig into UV scrolling techniques, we'll see actually you can do this really interesting thing with it as well.
I'm already feature creeping into my head, Dom. You don't have to worry.
Yeah.
like I was already thinking, like, especially for like the dance floor thing, like, can you give me one where it does it randomly, like jumps around to different ones instead of in a straight line or something? I mean, I don't know. I didn't show you this. This is a little trickier because there's 4 rows. But the same principle applies in terms of setting the increment as a fraction of the, dividing.
Yeah, the confusing part there is that you're like also scrolling through the vertical, and you want the vertical to scroll slower than the horizontal, because for every row it goes through, you want it to then, then after it scrolls through a row, then jump to the next row.
So that's why the speed on this is 4 on X,
right,
and then 1 on
right, because you want it to scroll through the horizontal 4 times as fast. For every time it's going to scroll through the vertical, it should have gone through the horizontal 4 times.
Yeah.
So it can be a little bit weird to think about how to, like, you're like, okay, I want to run this at 30 FPS or something. How do I do that? You just kind of have to do the math in your head or with a calculator or something like that. And it's not too bad, but it's a little bit unintuitive.
Also, don't forget, I mean, this UV scroll component is just a component you put on a mesh. So if you were following tutorials from previous weeks, like last week's where we did avatars, you could add this to your avatar. You could have
absolutely.
a flaming head on an avatar, or like have a little like
animated face.
Yeah,
like
a little
make your face like animated.
Face.
I have been thinking about, like, we have these different audio feedback components. So we have, like, right now we have scale audio feedback and morph audio feedback. A UV offset audio feedback would be pretty cool, where it just depending on a thing, it sets it to different increments of UV offset, and so you could do kind of like pre animated mouths or something like that. That'd be a pretty cool one, and pretty easy to add too. These audio feedback things are really easy to write.
Awesome. A lot of cool ideas are coming to me. Even just sitting in here looking at these and thinking about possibilities. But I know that we have a really great Hubs community that has been making really cool things, not just avatars, but environments and combinations of those. So I would love to see what you guys come up with. If you have ideas for how to improve the tool, definitely let us know, not only in Discord, but in our GitHub discussions. I think there are some lot of new discussions happening there.
And if you like to write code, pull requests. They're great. We actually got one from
requests are awesome, but actually doing the work and sharing it with us is even better.
Yeah,
So
we got a pull request just to add the visible component. It was like super simple, but we didn't add that one. So like, there's no way to make meshes that you have in Blender invisible. So someone added the visible component. I haven't merged that in yet, but that'll be in the next release of the Blender add-on. And yeah, and we have people thanking us in chat for the for the content. And
awesome. Well, thanks for joining us. And like I said, we're going to be trying to do this more regularly. We have more people on the Hubs team and in the mixed reality group that are interested in sharing their knowledge, sharing tutorials on all kinds of topics. So I'm looking forward to seeing what other people can show and share with the community.
And just another question. Fernando was asking like why is it done in this increment way instead of specifically saying okay like how many rows and how many columns and whatnot. And like I was saying before, I think I just did it in kind of a generic way because I'm not sure how else you might want to use this yet. If we discover like literally the only thing people are using this for is just like sprite sheet stuff, maybe we'll just make a sprite sheet component or whatever, and then you'll just say the rows and columns and you don't have to do the math yourself. But like I said, I suspect in the same way that the UV scroll stuff was kind of more useful than we maybe initially thought. Like you can kind of do those interesting like the disco floor thing is something I would not have thought of just but because it ended up being this kind of discrete thing. I left the increment thing in kind of a similarly generic way, and we'll see what people do with it. Yeah, like this thing I would not have thought of like using it basically as like an animation
blinker.
in that thing. Yeah, exactly. And so I like I said, I suspect people are going to use the increment thing in a different way as well.
Yeah, but a very good question. The question I had as I was trying to understand it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I remember
I was like, I don't want to do the math.
When I gave it to Christian at first too, he was just like, so like, but why can't I just? And I'm like, well, okay. If it becomes too difficult, we can do that. It's actually not like once you think through it, it's not too bad to do.
Not to mention,
it's definitely a little bit confusing.
Not to mention the fact that Blender lets you like type in the math and it'll figure it out.
Helps a lot.
So in the case of this fire, I was like, oh, I got to do 1/16 because there's 16 across, and I was like, oh, it just figured out 0.0625 is the increment, and dividing by 4 was easy. But
yeah, and like I said, if someone also wants to make a little tool where you just drag an image in or a GIF in or something, and it spits out a GLTF that has this UV scroll component on it, that'd be really cool.
Oh man, that would be great. It converts it.
Yeah, we can. I do think in hubs this will be a better way to render GIFs. Like if right now the way we render GIFs is kind of ugly, and a nicer way to do it would to be just generate a sprite sheet from a GIF at runtime, and then just use the UV scroll component. So we might do that at some point to rework how GIFs are rendered.
Yeah, there are a lot of tools out there to generate sprite sheets, though, I will say, for all different tools, for GIMP, for Photoshop. Blender, I know, has them. I think even Unity and other apps. So you can use things as intermediate tools to get what you want. But you can always draw.
And obviously you don't have to do this on a completely flat plane. Like all these are flat plane examples, but you can have this on the surface of a mesh. Like there's nothing. Nothing. It's just a texture, so it's.
Yeah, like that fire might work better if it was slightly curved, so that you'd have a little more room to move around it and still see it.
Yeah, or even put it on like a
round
balloon
thing.
Yeah, a round thing, like a
cylinder.
I don't think that would work exactly as is, but like the water example you have over there, like scrolling. I mean, like I'm betting there are things you can do with the increment stuff that will be useful in a way like that as well. I don't know what exactly they are, but.
Well, and also, I mean, incrementing them is a different style too. I mean, if you really wanted like water to look more like discrete frames instead of like a smooth looking thing, maybe that's what you're going for, and that's cool too.
Well, and then like you have on that waterfall there, you have like the middle kind of moving faster than the outsides. Like the increments would still kind of work that way too, potentially, and so
that's true.
You could get some pretty interesting effects. I don't really know exactly what the.
I know. I think we just need everyone to experiment with it.
Yeah, just try weird stuff.
So that's it for today, I think.
Yeah.
But unless there are any other last minute questions, I want to thank Dom for joining and sharing his expertise and for making these tools in the first place, which are empowering me and other users to to do some really cool things, and I can't wait to see what people come up with.
Yeah, it's been super fun, and maybe we'll do another one of these next week, maybe,
All right.
and kind of collect topics throughout the week as we discover stuff. Yeah,
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks, Dom, and thanks to the whole Hubs team for making such a cool thing. And we will see you around.
cool.
All right. Take care.
Yeah.